Good evening and welcome to our Wednesday night Bible study on biblical Christian ethics. We're looking at this part of the study that deals with our responsibility towards God and to His creation. God has created everything and He's put man in that creation, and we have a responsibility to maintain and take care of that creation. And we're looking at a number of things in regards to this. And tonight we're going to be looking at this whole matter of how we take care of our farmland. How do we take care of that? God has given instructions to the Israelites to allow the land to lay fallow every 7th year. The principle is simple. In the Bible, the number 7 occurs quite frequently. It is a number that is associated with God Himself and the completion of anything lies in this matter of the number 7. When you see that, we're talking about the completion, the top of the line of whatever it is associated with. In this particular case, the Hebrew people were instructed of God that you could farm your land for 6 consecutive years. On the 7th year, you didn't do one thing to it. Not one thing. You just left it alone. You didn't plow it. You didn't fertilize it. You didn't pull any weeds. You didn't plant anything in it. You did absolutely nothing to the land. And typically, after 6 years of growth of crops that were grown, planted, and harvested, typically what would happen at that point is, in the 7th year, weeds would pop up here and there and over there. And sometimes that which was planted in previous years in that field, some of the seed had fallen from the plants that wasn't harvested, and it came up in this off year. You were not to harvest that. You used to let everything just be as they are. Those who were basically classified as poor, they could come into these fields, and anything that had produced food, they could harvest that for themselves. They couldn't do anything else except take the ripe fruit or the ripe vegetables or the ripe grain. They could take that for themselves. And if they didn't take it or only took part of it, the rest of it they were instructed to leave for the wild animals, for them to come and do whatever with it. And then after the 7th year ended, then they could start this cycle over again. In God's creation, even to the human body, we are created in a series of 7s. The human body actually changes its skin every 7 years. It takes 7 years for your skin to totally regenerate. And then after that 7 years, then the second 7 years continues, and so on. That becomes a part of the aging process in humans. Initially, it results in maturing of the skin. And then, as you pass middle age of life, it begins to show age. And so that is a part of that cycle that runs. And they're to leave the ground in this particular case that 1 year. It was not to anything be done. And here we see the principle of soil conservation. It has taken man, modern man, some 1900 years to discover the advantages of that principle. Yet God told the Israelites to practice that principle centuries ago, many centuries ago. Current studies are out there, and in fact, they've been out for the last number of decades. It is now well known that the land needs that rest in order to rejuvenate itself and become more productive for the next series of 6 years of being planted and harvested. If you don't do that, the land wears out and ultimately will reach a point that it doesn't grow anything of any consistency to fullest maturity. You may get some here and there, but it doesn't give you a good harvest. In other words, the land wears out. Our human body, as we've already indicated, cycles in sevens. We can work 6 days, and we will see that in the passage of Scripture that we have here on the screen. We can work 6 days, and the 7th day is to be a day of rest. And rest, as it is understood in the Scriptures, is this way: ceasing of activity, changing activity from what you've done in the previous 6 days, and it is to be a time of worship where our focus is upon the Lord. And that began in the Garden of Eden. That God established that and set that up for His people to follow. And it is something that when we treat our bodies that way, you will find that you end up more healthy, less subject to diseases, find that you have more energy, and become more productive. You become mentally more alert as well. And it is a principle that is now known and understood, though today they don't want to call, well, that's God's standard. They just say that's what we discovered happens. Exodus chapter 23, verses 10 through 12. And 6 years thou shalt sow the land, and shalt gather in the fruits thereof. But the 7th year thou shalt let it rest and lie still. Literally meaning you don't bother it at all. It'll do whatever it does or don't do. You leave it alone. That the poor of thy people may eat, and what they leave, the beasts, the wild animals of the field, shall eat. In like manner thou shalt deal with thy vineyard and with thy olive yard. 6 days thou shalt do thy work, and on the 7th day thou shalt rest. Now that's talking about people. Again, it's a good principle. Works today as well. He goes on to explain that thine ox and thy donkey may rest, and the son of thy handmaid and the stranger may be refreshed. Again, referring to the slaves, the helpers in the family. But they are to have this time of rest as well. It is very important, even today, though it's not commanded to us under law. We know what the law says, and we know that the principle is good. And if we follow those things, not from a legalistic standpoint, but if we follow those things, we find ourselves better off for it. Okay, Joseph now. Some interesting things about Joseph. When Joseph was carried away into Egypt, God gave him wisdom, whereby he, Joseph, was to save his people, Israel, from the famine that was sweeping the nations. The interesting thing about this is, When Joseph came there, of course, he was sent there as a slave, and he was falsely accused of being inappropriate with the officer's wife, and all kinds of things. He ended up in prison. But then God, through a series of events, brought him out of prison. And he ultimately became the prime minister of Egypt. And he was second in command of the entire nation. Only Pharaoh had the highest position of command. And Pharaoh recognized that there was something about what Joseph said in regards to preparing for the drought, because he had had a dream that he didn't understand. There were 7 years of fat cattle, and then there were 7 years of skinny cattle, and he didn't know what all that meant. And only Joseph was able to interpret the dream for him. The fat cattle for those 7 years, it was a time of prosperity in the land, abundant prosperity. And then following that abundant prosperity, there was 7 years in which there was drought, and crops didn't grow, and it was going to be a very difficult time. People were going to be hungry, and starvation was setting in. And so Joseph, under God's direction, gave Pharaoh the formula on how to plan so that there would be enough food for cattle, enough food for the people, the Egyptians, as well as the Hebrews. And Pharaoh was impressed by all this, and he made Joseph the prime minister of Egypt. And so there came those prosperous years, and the abundance was gathered in. Rather than people just squandering it, it was stored. And then the 7 years of drought came, and the stored provisions were routinely and regularly distributed among the people and among the animals, and everybody survived. An interesting thought. Of course, many years later, some 400 years later, Israel was now slaves to the Egyptian. They didn't occupy the high prestige of honor in Egypt when Joseph was alive and there. A different order of government among the pharaohs came to power, none of which knew anything about Joseph, the scripture tells us. And they just saw the Hebrew people as slaves, and so they were enslaved. And they mistreated them and gave them a real difficult time. And so Moses was called of God to go to Pharaoh and say, let the people go. And it was on again, off again. And when it was on again, they started to leave. When Pharaoh said no, then plagues came upon the land. And finally, when the firstborn in the home, the seventh plague, he said, okay, you can go. And then when they got to the Red Sea, the Hebrew people got to the Red Sea, here comes Pharaoh with all of his armies to get his slaves again. And of course, we know what happened there. He and his army perished in the Red Sea. But the interesting thing is, God's grace was upon Egypt in those early days with Joseph. If there had not been a Joseph, and God had provided another way for his people, Israel, to endure the drought, which God could have any way he wanted to, Egypt would have been gone. They would have not existed. They would not have lasted. And they would not even be in existence today. There'd be somebody else there, but they would not have been the Egyptians. And it's just interesting how these things come about. Remembering that God is always in charge, God is always in control, and He knows absolutely everything. Well, He gave him wisdom that the Israelites could be saved, as well as the Egyptian and other nations. Genesis chapter 41, verses 34 through 36. Let Pharaoh do this, and let him appoint officers over the land, and take up a fifth part of the land of Egypt in the 7 plenteous years. And let them gather all the food of those good years that come, and lay up corn under the hand of Pharaoh. The word corn, as it is used here, refers to all sorts of grains, wheat, barley, oats, and so on, as well as perhaps what we call maize. And let them keep the food in the cities and storehouses. And that food shall be for store to the land against the 7 years of famine, which shall be in the land of Egypt, that the land perish not through the famine. So, wow. God provided even for the Egyptians. And the Egyptians didn't even recognize and realize what God had done when Joseph was there. Well, in Proverbs chapter 21 and verse 20, we read these words. There is treasure to be desired, and oil in the dwelling of the wise, but a foolish man spendeth it up. This particular passage of Scripture is referring to the gathering of income, as we would call it today, and they didn't necessarily deal with coins and dollar bills and things like that, though those did exist. But it's some form of gathering in. And the verse is pointing out here that it's unwise that everything you get, you spend. Because there's going to come a time that you're going to need some money, a cushion. You're going to need that. And it's interesting how we've come today that the practice seems to be with most people, spend it all. If you got $100, spend all $100. If you got $1,000, spend all the $1,000. If you got $100,000, spend that. And so on. No idea of actually setting apart a certain amount and saving it, as we have come to call it, the rainy day. The rainy day does come. And if you live long enough, you'll have several rainy days in your life as you go through the years. But the wisdom that the Scripture is setting forth here is that of not spending everything. We have gotten in a very bad habit in America and in the world as a whole. You will find it everywhere. That we spend what we have. And then we borrow to buy what we do not have the money to pay for. There is no sin in borrowing money. But the Bible warns us about borrowing. It's put in words like this. He who borrows becomes the slave of the lender. And as long as you're making your payments, you think everything's okay. but you're really a slave. You have to make those payments, or you're in deep trouble. And if you don't make those payments, boy, you really are in deep trouble. And we become a nation and a people here in America that have become the most spending of money beyond what our means is. We borrow for everything, all the time. The national debt is now just shy $34 trillion. And it's 300 billion short of $34 trillion. And so, boy, that's a lot of money. It'll take forever to get there. No, it don't. Not when you spend the way we spend as a nation. We spend and give away billions. And very quickly that adds up to trillions. America is now the most heavily indebted nation. When you consider the debt nationally of the round figures $34 trillion now, and you add to that all the business debt, you add that all the personal debt, anything, any company, organization, or individual, the amount of debt that they have, believe it or not, they can give you a figure for it. With our $34 trillion and the sum total of all debt in America comes to $102 trillion. Debt is very attractive. It's very attractive because it enables us to live beyond our means. My parents grew up at a day and time that had come through the Great Depression that was caused by the collapse of the stock market. And that they learned a lot of things about debt. Don't get into debt. My mom and dad, they got married back in the 1930s. They themselves were in their early 30s. And they got married. And they went out and they bought a house. Both of them had worked all their lives. And they had accumulated and wisely took the Scripture's advice about not spending everything that you got. And they bought a house. They paid cash for the house. The house only cost $3,000. They'd say, oh, that's got to be a dump. Well, in the 1930s, that was the average price of the average working family's home in America. And you, of course, had wealthy people that had mansions or palaces and things of that nature, but those were very far and few between. But these were not, a $3,000 home back then was not some ratty old place. Well, they paid cash for that. My parents never had a mortgage. Never had a mortgage. Their house was never under a debt. My father also in the 30s bought a 1936 Ford V8. Oh, that was the hot car in those days. Brand new, $600. He paid cash for it. And that's the way my family lived. And I grew up in a home that you lived on your income, but you didn't spend all your income. One of the things that the debt does, and it's a byproduct of debt, it feeds and nourishes a thing called inflation. Inflation comes about when people are making and borrowing money. How much more can we get for this product or service that we're offering? Well, let's try raising the price. Not because they really have to, but because they're motivated by two sins: greed and covetousness. They're never satisfied. They're never happy. John D. Rockefeller was asked one time before he died, "What will make you happy, John?" He was not a happy man. And his answer was to make one more million. And you see, when money becomes such a controlling factor in your life, no amount of money satisfies. You always need more. And a person who doesn't have $1 million and is only making a few $1,000s, $50,000, $60,000, and here's a millionaire making $1 million or $2 million a year. And you look at it and say, boy, if I had that, I wouldn't have to worry about anything. I'd be fixed for life. And yet, the tragedy is, the more you gain, the more you begin to need, because you're not satisfied and you want more. And very quickly it becomes greed motivated. It becomes covetousness. The neighbor got this, or the neighbor could do that. I got to do that too. And this drives a thing called inflation. The price of goods and services starts going up. Not because it has to, because they want to get more money for goods and services. And then the people that, the peons, as they say, they need more money too to survive in that. And they begin to cling to debt. And very quickly, it becomes out of control. It takes control of everything. And so, the prices rise. Now, how can we make the product so that we could sell more product? Well, it's called built-in obsolescence. In other words, the product is not made to the highest standard or quality that they have the technology or the ability or the know-how to make. They make it of lesser quality. So it begins to fail. And we become dissatisfied with that. And so we need to replace it. And by this time, what was costing, like in the Ford situation with my father, $600, what cost $600? Well, in 1950, he bought a Studebaker, new one. It was now $1,200, double in about 15, 16 years. It had doubled. And so up and up and up and up, and inflation goes. Ultimately, the balloon reaches a point it bursts. That's what happened with debt and the Social Security, or not Social Security, but the stock market in 1929. And the nation struggled to get out of debt, to get back on board. 10 years later, in 1939, the nation had not recovered. Wow. Struggled. And our nation today is in enormous debt. The balloon keeps getting bigger. it will burst. Inflation driving the economy ultimately reaches a point that it can no longer stretch. It pops. In 2008, the real estate market had that type of an experience. Before the collapse of the market, houses were being appraised at enormous sums. A house that was normally going for $500,000 was going for over $1 million. And then the bubble burst. And people now are upside down in their houses. The houses are no longer worth that. Many of them lost half or more of their value. And yet they still owed unbelievable amounts of money against a piece of property that was no longer could be sold for that amount of money. And there's a big day coming. But this is one of the things that this passage of Scripture warns about. Foolish man spendeth it up, spends it all. And then he goes that and borrows. And it just keeps going and going and going. The slothful man, Proverbs 12:27. Slothful means lazy. It's an old word that means lazy. The slothful man roasteth not that which he took in hunting. The roasting here is cooking what he hunted, whether it was deer or bear or bison or whatever. He just was hunting for sport. That's all. Just for the sport. But substance of a diligent man is precious. The indicating here is, if you're going to go hunting, scripturally speaking, that's okay. But it's not just to mount the head on the wall of your family room. It's to provide food and sustenance. That's okay. The New Testament also contains teaching regarding the principles of conservation and preservation. Conservation is saving what you have. Preservation is maintaining the society, feeding it so that it keeps on going. In the well-known parable of the prodigal son, Luke 15:11 through 32, can be found a lesson in not being wasteful. That was the sin of the prodigal son. He took his inheritance, said, "Father, give me my inheritance," and off he goes. He lives a lavish lifestyle. All kinds of friends, partying all the time. And the money ran out. And the friends disappeared. Oh my. Yeah, that's the way that usually goes. Wasteful. Even in the performance of a miracle, Jesus was concerned with the principle of conservation. When he multiplied the loaves and the fishes, he gave instructions so that the extra would not be wasted. Gather it up. First of all, it showed that a miracle had taken place. Second of all, this is fresh food. It just was left over. It was not used, that it might be redistributed to others who have need. Conservation.